Warning, this content may be disturbing to some audiences. Subscribe. If you dare.
I pointed out to my grandmother and she goes over there and starts removing the sand around it and she notices blood on the rock. She then pulls it out of the sand and it's a human skull. Hey everybody, welcome to ANECDOSED. People ask Reddit. Campers, backpackers and park rangers of Reddit. What is the weirdest or creepiest thing you have found while in the woods?
Number 1.
Not me, but a buddy found a young kid, 16 I think, in the process of trying to hang himself about 5 years ago. He was hooking a makeshift noose up to a tree. Upon seeing my friend he stopped. My buddy talked with him and they walked and talked. This lad was gay and his parents and family had disowned him when he came out to them. My buddy and his wife let him stay with them for a few weeks until he moved to a family member's house. They are still firm friends.
Number 2.
When I was a kid in the mid-90s, my friends and I were hiking around in the woods behind our house on some Weyerhaeuser timber property and found an abandoned farmhouse. The weird thing was that the house had been left very suddenly. There was still unopened mail and magazines sitting on the coffee table, all dated back to the same date in the 1950s. Sheets and blankets still on the beds, clothes still in the drawers, pantry full of canned and jarred food, half of it exploded or leaking after so many years. Dishes in the sink, dishes on the table. Unburned candles still sitting out waiting to be used. A fridge outside full of food that had turned to muck and dust. After exploring the house for a while we checked out the farm. The chicken coop had dozens of chicken skeletons, wrapped in desiccated skins or picked bare. There were 2 pig skeletons in a pen, and the remains of a horse and several cows in the surrounding pasture. A tractor was parked in the garage, and was in great shape for its age. It didn't occur to me as a kid at the time, but aside from the house having been left so suddenly, it was really remarkable that the entire place was undisturbed. There was no vandalism, no sign of entry, and as far as I could tell, we were the first individuals to set foot in there in 40 years.
Number 3.
I had a relative that would seek out ghost towns and I went with him on a few of his excursions. Most of the time, you would find one that was relatively well known. Things were overgrown, but there would be signs of squatters/campers/hunters vandalism, etc. One time he found out about a very small town that was abandoned in the 20s. After a ton of research, he loaded up supplies and planned a hike to see if he could find it. After several unsuccessful solo attempts, he brought me along. The hike started out at an old abandoned railroad junction that was itself 5 to 10 miles off the road. We followed a rail line for about 5 miles that kept diminishing as we went. Eventually we got to a point where there was no longer any sign of the railroad line and we kept going. He was an experienced hiker and he had a plan where he wanted to go this time. After about 15 or so more miles we found it. The town itself was very small. I think there were about 5 houses and a really small general store, think about the size of a small convenience store. Some of the houses were in relatively decent condition and a couple of them had been abandoned very quickly. Furniture and pictures left behind, clothes and other belongings packed but not taken, etc. It was surreal. We found a letter that was dated 1922, which was about the time that he speculated that the town was abandoned. The store had some product left on the shelves, but this was not like a store in the traditional sense. Maybe more like a trading post. There were a few advertising signs and a few boxes of soap flakes and canned items that we couldn't make out. I guess the story was that the town existed because it was on a rail line. There was a grain storage facility that originally was located a few miles away on the rail line. My uncle speculated that the people in the town either owned or ran the grain facility. The grain facility burned down and the rail line was diverted away. Thus the little town died. Or it could have been that the rail line diverted and then the grain facility burned down later. Either way. Like I said, I've been to a few ghost towns before. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The people that lived there were relatively well off, not rich, necessarily. This did not appear to be a farming community, like you'd expect. Everything just looked frozen in time. There were no roads anywhere nearby. The closest paved road was probably 30 miles away. It is possible that we were one of a handful of people who saw that place since it was abandoned. This place was out in the middle of nowhere. My uncle found out about the town by seeing a reference to it on a very old railroad map. Again, these were railroad lines that hadn't been used in over 50 years.
Number 4.
My cousin and I once stumbled upon a trailer home like this. We weren't hiking per se but just exploring the woods near my home. We had walked about a mile down an old dirt road and there was a sort of grown-up trail, Later discovered to be a driveway, we decided to take it and see what was there. We found a very dilapidated trailer home that literally looked like the people had just left one day for work and never returned. Unopened mail, old checks that had been written and never sent, pictures on the walls, clothes in the closets. It was so odd. We live in a tiny town, but no one seems to know who lived there or where they went.
Number 5.
I was like 12 and lived near the sand dunes. We used to hike there all the time. My grandmother came to visit, so we both went on a hike, and I see this weird circular rock in the sand. I pointed out to my grandmother, and she goes over there and starts removing the sand around it, and she notices blood on the rock. She then pulls it out of the sand, and it's a human skull. We reported it to the police. So what happened was that this dude was killed by his roommate, and he cut him into 5 pieces and buried each part in a different location in the sand dunes. We found the last missing piece. His skull. We were on the news. Pretty cool memory I have of my grandmother.
Number 6.
I was hiking in the woods on a property my father rented as farm ground with my older brother. After a while we noticed a sickly sweet smell. Being farm kids, we knew what it was, something dead and left to rot. As we kept walking, we entered a marsh-like area, soft, squishy ground and very tall grass. We had walked through marsh-like areas before, so we walked on the large grass clumps, being very careful where we placed our feet. After making it to a large clump of solid ground, I look up and find a massive pile of skinned animal carcasses. The pile was easily over 10 feet tall, with a 15-foot circumference. It consisted of every animal you could think of: rabbit, fox, coyote, deer, weasel, cat, dog, raccoon, and others I couldn't recognize. The old man that owned the land trapped year-round for anything he could get. He just kept throwing the carcasses in the same pile year after year. After we left the area, it dawned on me, the marsh was not in a lowland like most marshy places. The group was just saturated with the decaying fluids of all those animals. That's also the reason the grass was abnormally tall in that area.
Number 7.
I've been homeless. A lot. I lived in some distant family's land where they have an old cabin up on stilts, due to the local woods flooding heavily sometimes. Illinois is weird. Anyway, I spent a good amount of time in this old cabin. Wood stove, porch swing hanging from the ceiling that I used as a bed. Overall, it was an okay place, and it wasn't too far of a drive to town for food. You just had to tolerate the half-mile walk to your car. One day I am out walking around the woods, and in a smallish clearing in the path, I easily see a good 50 to 60 dead geese. Every one of them is mangled in horrific ways, necks ripped off of the bodies splayed out over old timbers and fence posts, feathers everywhere. Bones sticking out of the dirt. It just looked like a straight-up goose genocide. The ground was dry, and there was a lot of dust, but I saw no prints, and there was no other evidence of anything being in the area aside from what one can only assume was some sort of strange breed of exploding goose. I also found a torn open old backpack and a great deal of candy wrappers strewn about it. Way too moldy to identify anything about it. I decided to turn back and see if I could grab a camera when I started hearing this god-awful shrieking noise, as if it were coming from every possible nook and cranny within a 30-foot radius. I took off pretty fast when that started. To this day, my best guess is some sort of massive commune of foxes. It really is the only rational solution I can come to. Still scared the shit out of me.
Number 8.
My parents own a small cabin and some land out in a remote area of Alberta. One day we came across a bunch of Inukshukes, large stones stacked on each other to resemble, in this case, people. They were all dressed up, some in little girl dresses, children's jumpers, safety vests, parkas, some had hats on them, and all of them were seriously creepy. We had no idea where they came from or who put them there. We started making up scary stories around the campfire about this mystery person, and we started pulling pranks on each other. Inukshuk suddenly erected overnight outside of our friend's tent. Lots of scary Blair Witch stuff to freak each other out. My mom went to this social event that the farmers and ranchers in the area put on every year. She mentioned the Inukshuks to an old couple, and they told her that their adult son with a variety of mental disorders put those up. Apparently they calm him down, and it's very therapeutic for him. It was nice to know that a real person put those up and not evil forest spirits or an axe murderer.
Number 9.
Not really camping, but as kids we lived in a new neighborhood. It was next to about 400 acres of woods and old farmland. There were several abandoned houses and barns, equipment, and random junk. It was great to grow up there, as we spent nearly every day exploring the area. But there was one house off the main road, but about 200 yards into the woods. It looked abandoned, but a woman lived there. We found out the hard way by trying to get into the house one day, and she came out screaming at us to get the hell off her property. She was scary looking as hell. She wore a dirty dress and had gross stringy hair, and looked like she hadn't taken a shower for years. She looked to be in her 30s. Needless to say, we stayed away from her most of the time. We also never told our parents because we knew that they wouldn't let us play back there anymore. We did go back sometime though. We named her Crazy Mary, and we'd spy on here, and dare each other to get as close as possible. Even then we never got closer than 100 feet from her house. About 10 to 12 years later I am home from college and my mom tells me about how they took this woman to the mental hospital. Apparently she lived there this whole time with her dead mother and father propped up in their chairs in the living room. They figured the parents were dead for 10 to 15 years, but died of natural causes, and Mary had propped them up in the chairs after they died. That meant they were probably freshly dead when we got chased away by Crazy Mary.
Number 10.
One afternoon I was completing this 14 kilometers, 5-hour, hike on the edge of town. It's an unkept track with uneven ground, overgrown, and in many places you rely on colored markers nailed into trees because the track is covered in grass. It's not the easiest hike, and it's into some pretty unforgiving terrain. We're all wearing hiking shoes, long pants and long sleeve shirts to minimize the risks of snake bites, cuts, etc. We were the only people on the track that day that we saw. It's late afternoon and we're about 2 kilometers from the remote trailhead. We come up onto this ridge and see somebody heading for us. We initially thought he was naked, but as he approached we discovered he was wearing budgie smugglers, speedos, and thongs, flip-flops for the Americans. He approaches on the track, says good afternoon and continues wandering along the track. He's got 2 hiking poles, no bag or clothing other than the budgie smugglers, and no torch we could see. By the time we got back to the car it was dark. We hung around for a bit packing up the cars but didn't see the man emerge back from the trailhead. There were no other cars parked at the trailhead either. The country he was hiking into isn't very forgiving, and there's no easy way you can loop back to civilization except via the trailhead. He came prepared with hiking poles, but why was he only wearing budgie smugglers and thongs? I have so many questions for this man. Make sure to share your personal story in the comments below and have the opportunity to be featured in a future video. Also, if you like these topics, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification button to continue seeing more content like this every day. See you next time.